So today's episode, I want to talk about the hipster phenomenon as I saw it in Brooklyn in the 2010s. So the word hipster was something that I or anybody else who was in Brooklyn in the 2010s would certainly hear a lot, especially in the first part of the decade. So, as I mentioned, especially in North Brooklyn, there was a huge influx of young uh, young young people from particularly other parts of the country and even other parts of the world who were moving into Brooklyn. Okay, so um, crime went down in the 90s. Brooklyn became safer. The city was rezoned in 2005, and it was all over TV, and it was word got out that these artsy, cool people were moving there, and then more people, young people especially, wanted to move there. So that's what you had. As I've said in other videos, by the 2000s, first decade of the century, and continuing into the 2010s. So the most notable of these people were the hipsters, and they kind of became the face of this new generation of people that was moving to Brooklyn. And the hipster, I must say, is very hard to define, but also very easy to pick out of a lineup. Okay, so the hipster was more than anything young people. They were predominantly white. Very easily, they could be of Asian American descent too, and they could be from any other races as well. But they were predominantly white, mostly from other states, and this could be from the Midwest, from California, from the West Coast, the South. I met quote unquote hipsters from all parts of the country, and there were even some who were international too. Typically, they arrived in Brooklyn with some kind of ambition, and it was usually on the more artistic side of things. They were pursuing some kind of art, some kind of craft, or some kind of business related to the arts. Could be TV and film, could be writing, um, music. Uh, Within these industries, usually. Okay, now some of them ended up working as baristas or waiters or all different kinds of things. But usually they had some kind of ambition to make it in the arts in New York City, and a lot of them settled in Brooklyn because the rents were cheaper, especially in the early part of the 2000s in Williamsburg, Greenpoint. All these neighborhoods were still in the process of revitalization and reviving. They still were very industrial. There was still much more crime back then, and it was definitely a much more affordable place for people to live. Now, this was much less so in the 2010s because already so many had moved in, so many more wanted to move in. It was just happening all the time towards the end of the 2000s, early 2010s. I know because I was one of them. So already by that time, the rents were high. But Brooklyn, as I've said in other videos, was just the place to be. So vibrant, so many things going on, so much energy at this time that people just kept moving in. So that led to another one of the more derogatory aspects of the hipsters. People saw it was that they were trust fund babies, that they were from rich families, that they were being supported or partially supported by relatives, by their parents, that a lot of them were dilettantes, people who they maybe had some kind of ambition but were slackers, they were lazy. This was one of the more negative stereotypes of the hipster. That yeah, they were on the surface they wanted to be in New York. Well, on the surface they were pursuing something, but really they wanted to be in New York City because it was cool. It was better than they felt. It was more trendy than from where they were from. Some of them were from small towns and they didn't fit in there, and they just felt they fit in better in New York City, wanted to meet other people like themselves, were snobs. So now, so okay, so that was what a lot of people said about them. And I must also say, why were they so easy to identify out of a lineup? I'd say circa 2010, you could often spot them out by the way they dressed and carried themselves. A lot of them, even they would be from certain places in the country, they certainly didn't have a New York City accent. They might have the accent of where they were from, Midwest or the South, so that made them easy to spot out. Often they didn't even have that. They just had kind of a more standard American accent than people whose families had lived in New York City for generations. Um, I mean, just a lot of them, like I said, were white, and they were living in neighborhoods that predominantly were populated by people of Hispanic or Caribbean, African American heritage, and they just stood out from being white, and especially from the clothes they wore. A lot of thrift store clothes. They were known for wearing like kind of funky looking eyeglasses. There was a stereotype that they in around the maybe 2010 that they were wearing like glasses without any lenses. I don't know if I ever actually saw that, but I certainly heard about it. Maybe it was a couple people and just something people latched onto. Just stuff like man purses, skinny jeans was definitely a thing that I can say I saw a lot around 2010. These kind of orange winter hats they would wear, like shirts. It was especially around the earlier part of the decade and the 2000s that they'd wear shirts with like cartoon characters. There was some like irony was a thing with them. Whether I can certainly say it was a part of their humor, part of their the way they carried themselves. There was like irony to a lot of what they said. Sometimes this was exaggerated and more of a stereotype, but definitely was true in some respects. They would often talk about music. A lot of them were musicians or tried to be musicians, had bands on the side, and were known as music snobs. That was probably true in a lot of ways. They would be into obscure bands that most people had never heard of, would like more like esoteric kinds of rock or rap. They would sometimes look down on popular kinds of music, or they would like it ironically, something like that. So they were pretty easy to spot out. I mean, if you were walking down Bushwick and you saw a group of them, or even one of them, you definitely knew it. Everybody had dogs, but they especially loved dogs. I don't know. I guess that was something. Maybe a little like overbearing with dogs, you could say, to some extent. Like, you'd be walking down Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick or something, and you saw a blonde girl in like a satin 1980s Chicago Bears jacket with Doc Martens and a bright orange construction workers winter hat, knit cap. That was a hipster right there. And they were very skinny also. Often that I can definitely say. You see a guy very tight, very much skinny jeans and he's wearing some kind of old 1980s Converse sneakers, and I don't know, a freaking trench coat and some trucker hat or something. I mean, just you get the idea. It was a lot of mismatching thrift store stuff, and you saw them walking around. I mean, the people who've lived there for generations, maybe you have more of the urban styles or something. I mean, it stood out. You knew it when you saw it. However, that brings me to another aspect. This is a fascinating thing about the hipster that I observed in Brooklyn, was that they were all around, but people often didn't want to identify as hipsters, or at least I met a lot of people who would definitely fall into that category, but didn't identify as hipsters. I don't know if I ever met anybody who openly said they were, not that I can remember. But that was an aspect of it. It had some negative connotations, and a lot of people didn't want to be identified as one, although they clearly fit into a lot of the categories, and that's why they were there. There was some contradiction about them being generally identifying as nonconformists, but over time, especially I'd say towards the middle of the decade, there was ended up being a lot of conformity about the politics they had, the way they dressed, the way they thought, the way they spoke, and so there was some self-loathing there. Now, so this was a real predominant trend phenomenon, I would say, from the early 2000s. I don't think it really existed in the 90s, definitely by the early mid 2000s, and I would say up through 2015 or so. It continued to survive in a lot of ways. Maybe not under that name, but in a lot of the aspects of the hipster continue to exist and probably still do exist in neighborhoods like Bushwick or maybe Sunset Park. I'm not really sure about Sunset Park, but kind of where the younger generation of artsy people moved towards the end of the 2010s. There was a lot of talk about in the 2010s when I got there about, well, what was going to happen to these people. I mean, a lot of them just couldn't or weren't going to continue with this lifestyle. I mean, how long can you live in some old 120-year-old apartment in Brooklyn, or just continue trying to be an artist? Most of them were just not going to make it. It's just the reality of the arts. So a lot of people were saying, well, they're going to sell out, and some of them already were selling out. We're going for more mature careers in industries, or we're kind of giving in to more maybe materialistic lifestyle that they never thought they would live. I don't have statistics on it, how many actually did. For sure, I knew some who didn't stay in Brooklyn and moved to other places. I don't know what happened with them. Some of them, ended up moving to Park Slope, things like that, when they got a little older, got married, started families. I would say it died out towards the end of the 2010s as a phenomenon. It just, it had its time, and it carried on in some ways in Bushwick and places like that, but it was not the same. So as for the stereotypes, and what I thought about them, now, I mean, people called me a hipster. I don't know, not many, but some did. I suppose I fit into some of the categories in some ways. Moved to Brooklyn, around 2012. I was hanging out there much earlier, 2009. 2010, but moved permanently in 2012. I pursued a craft, and I lived in an old apartment, a one-bedroom apartment, well into my 30s. You could say, yeah, the delayed adulting was a thing. Anyway, so were they trust fund babies? Now, it's hard to tell because it really, a lot of them, you know, were pursuing something in Brooklyn, and it wasn't something people opened up about. Like, it's not something to be really proud of. Like, well, I'm supported or partially supported by my parents. I mean, you heard some people admit it to some extent, that there was money, that there was support coming from somewhere else. It's hard to tell exactly. I mean, it's I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it was talked about a lot. It was talked about by a lot of people who probably were being supported by themselves. Like I said, by relatives. Like I said, there was an aspect of self-loathing to pursuing a life of nonconformity, pursuing a life of independence, and starting anew, but yet falling into traps of conformity, falling into dependence on your back on your parents, possibly, who you were trying to get away from their lifestyle. I definitely saw it, but here's the thing. I mean, there were people who I met who would fall into a lot of the negative stereotypes, but there were people who were really talented who moved to Brooklyn at this time, and some of them became very successful. I personally know some of them. They were people who worked hard, got up in the morning, and really uh, stuck to the grind, whether it was art or crafts or TV and film. And these people were talented. They were smart. They were hardworking. They really moved to Brooklyn to pursue something. Um, so I met quite a few of them, and whatever their background, some of them were rich kids. I know some of them were people from very privileged backgrounds, but they really did well for themselves, and it was up to their own talent, skill, and ability. So I really saw a whole wide spectrum from the hipsters, and you could really say a lot of them were music snobs. I can tell you that. They wore very tight pants. You could say that. Funky clothes. Yeah, had been in a band or were in a band or wanted to be in a band. You could say that. As far as the more negative aspects, were they dilettantes? Were they phonies? It's a mixed bag. That's what I'd tell you. It was a mixed bag, but there were some really, really talented people who moved to Brooklyn in this influx, who fit into the hipster phenomenon, and to just write them off as phonies does not do them justice. It's like I said, it's hard to tell, but I can really tell you that there were people who were the real deal from this group of people. And overall, I think most of them were moving to Brooklyn to really, pursue something, and they really contributed to what I feel was a great time in a lot of ways. I mean, there's definitely downsides to it too, but they contributed to making it a what it was at that time. So yeah, I as I've said before, I mean, I witnessed all of this from 2009, 2010 onwards to 2019. If you want to discuss this, if you have questions, leave it in the comments. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. If you want to hear more content about Brooklyn in the 2010s, I saw it all from North to South Brooklyn. I'm going to have other videos about other parts of Brooklyn, even South Brooklyn, what I saw in the decade. I was there to all of it. I visited every single neighborhood, spent considerable amount of time in every neighborhood of Brooklyn. So, signing off. That's another video. Take care.